Hi, my name is Julie and I'm one of the violinists in Tafelmusik. Today's treatise is the Leopold Mozart Violin School, this one. A treatise on the fundamental principles of violin playing. Now this is one of my favorite treatises because it was written by Mozart's dad, and it was written in the same year that little Wolfie was born. And I love this time period, this transition between the Baroque and classical times. This treatise was written only 6 years after Bach died, and Mozart started his first violin lessons with his dad just a few years later at age 3. Now, like many treatises, this one starts with the basics. So he talks about like what is a quarter note and what are the notes on the violin, but it quickly becomes pretty complicated. One of the nice things about starting at the beginning is that Leopold shows 2 good ways to hold the violin. On the front cover, he's holding it chin off, which he says, "This position is undoubtedly natural and pleasant to the eyes of the onlookers, but somewhat difficult and inconvenient for the player, as, during quick movements of the hand in the high position, the violin has no support and must therefore necessarily fall, unless by long practice the advantage of being able to hold it between the thumb and index finger has been acquired." So that means you have to practice your thumb shifting if you're going to hold your violin chin off. Now he shows also another good way to hold the violin, a more chin-on approach, which he calls the comfortable method, where the E string side of the violin comes under the chin. He also warns you with this method you have to watch your bow arm. You don't want a high elbow, like in this picture. In chapter 4, Leopold talks about bowing. And at the very beginning, in section 3, he says, "So the first and chief rule should be, if the first crotchet, quarter note, of a bar does not begin with a rest, whether it be even or uneven time, so whether if it's in 2 or it's in 3, one endeavors to take the first note of each bar with a downstroke, a down bow, and this even if 2 down bows should follow each other. For example, or now what's the cool thing about this is that these are French bowings, very similar to what somebody like Muffat would have been recommending 60 years earlier. Now, there are lots of exceptions to this rule, as he points out later, like if you have consecutive quarter notes, but I love that this is his starting point. Now, how do we read treatises like this? And I think it's almost more helpful to read them in small sections and kind of like a workbook. So it can be helpful to have your violin out while you're reading them, and also to read things about what you're thinking about or what you're playing specifically. So if you're having some problems, read the bowing chapter. If you're having problems with shifting, read the shifting chapter. You might get some great ideas. You also can read it out loud with friends, or read it together to each other. Sometimes the language is a little bit flowery and hard to understand, so it helps to do it with somebody else, and you can read it to each other and try to decipher what he's trying to say. Chapter 8 is all about shifting, and he's got some great tips in there that I use all the time, like, for example, shifting to finger 2 instead of finger 1 in a scale going up. So instead of shifting here, you can get a nice clean shift if you shift at the same time you're articulating. And the same goes for shifting in dotted rhythms on the dot. So if we have, we shift there. So I definitely recommend his shifting chapter. In some of the later chapters, you find out all about ornamentation, trills, like starting on the upper note, and appoggiaturas, like the appoggiatura is supposed to be half the value of the note. All that kind of good stuff you'll find in there. In chapter 12, he gives some great advice on performing. The good performance of a composition, according to modern taste, is not as easy as one might imagine, who believe themselves to be doing well, if they embellish and befrill a piece right foolishly out of their own heads, and who have no sensitiveness whatever for the affect which is to be expressed in the piece. In chapter 12, section 7, he says, before beginning to play, the piece must be well looked at and considered. The character, tempo, and kind of movement demanded by the piece must be sought out and carefully observed. And then he goes on to say, in practicing, every care must be taken to find and to render the affect which the composer wished to have brought out. And as sadness often alternates with joy, each must be carefully depicted according to its kind. In a word, all must be so played that the player himself must be moved thereby.